Now, and on to our story. President Biden admitting that critics who say he's too old for the presidency may be right. The president revealing to Democratic donors that he would have skipped a re-election bid if he were not facing Donald Trump. Joe telling them this during a fundraiser: "If Trump wasn't running, I'm not sure I'd be running, but we cannot let him win for the sake of the country." Biden then had to walk back his comments and insisted that he would be running no matter what.
Would you be running for president if Trump wasn't running?
I expect so, but look, he is running, and I have to run.
Would you drop out if Trump runs out?
No, not now.
Do you think there is any Democrat who could defeat Donald Trump other than you?
Probably 50 of them.
You do believe that there are?
I'm not the only one to defeat him, but I will defeat him.
Who else do you think could defeat Donald Trump, Mr. President?
But former President Donald Trump thinks Joe Biden won't even be his opponent in the 2024 race.
I personally don't think he makes it. I think he's in bad shape physically. Do you remember when he said, "I'd like to take him behind the barn"? If he took me behind the barn and I went like this, I believe he'd fall over. I see Biden talking about, oh, MAGA, MAGA. MAGA means make America great again. That's what it means. And that's what people want.
Jesse, usually in a closed-door fundraiser, you say what you mean. And so this came out of the fundraiser, and then he had to try to walk it back. But pretty much he's admitting that President Trump is the lifeline of his candidacy.
Fundraiser Biden's my favorite Biden.
That's a good Biden.
That's a good Biden. But he's telling the truth, and he never tells the truth. So he's saying he's the only one who can beat Trump, and that's why he's running. But then what, Dana? So he's going to run, win, and then give Kamala the keys to the White House? He's not running for a second term. He's just running as a grudge match. And then it's here, Kamala, you're next. What about us? What about the voters? It should be about the voters. It shouldn't be about your personal obsession with your opponent. He hasn't laid out a vision for the second term. He hasn't laid out an agenda for the second term. I don't like that. And I believe now, every time Trump says this, that he's not going to make it, I'm starting to agree. Because today, when he was asked, why are you hanging out with your brother and your son's associates? And he said, that's a lie. Now, this isn't Donald Trump saying that, I had a big crowd on Inauguration Day, or I thought the hurricane was going to hit this state. This is like going out in front of the American people and the American press corps and saying the sky is green and then just walking away. We have photos of him at dinners with the associates. We have logs to the White House, to the vice president's residence of him meeting dozens of his son and brother's associates. We have his own lawyers explaining why he was on the phone to his son's associates, because it was just talk about the weather. So if everything's kosher, and am I saying that correctly? If everything is kosher, Jessica, why is he blatantly lying about that? And can he do that for a whole year?
You could talk about that, Jessica, if you want, or I could ask you the question I just had here, which was, this will add another log to the fire of people who think he won't be the nominee and that he doesn't really want the job, and that he's preventing this civil war from breaking out in the Democratic Party, which might need to happen for there to be a next generation.
So I'll start with the Jew question. Yes, that was the proper use of the term
Yiddish.
Kosher. So a couple of things. I also enjoy fundraiser Biden, and frankly think he should have stuck with it, because that was the argument that he made in 2020, and it persuaded 81 million people that he was the right person for that job. And we've seen, in terms of turnout and everything else, from the midterms to all these referendums, that Donald Trump juices his base, but he really juices Democrats, and they show up to vote against him. And Joe Biden has done incredibly well in the Trump era, not only winning his own election, but his party has overperformed expectations time and time again. And a lot of that has to do with the me versus Trump of all of this. And I don't think he should have walked it back, frankly, and then gone on to say, oh, 50 other Dems could have done it. We all know that's not true. I'm sure there are a couple other Democrats that could have done it, but It's about you. It's about the agenda that you set forward and building on your progress. Finish the job. To your point about all these things that the Republicans have Joe Biden doing, the pictures and the blah, 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 you really need to take James Comer's job because he's terrible at it. Every interview that he does, whether it's on our network or this morning, he showed up on NBC, and props to him for going into enemy territory or whatever. He got absolutely destroyed. The big revelation of the week was the under $4,000 truck loan. Which has been, it's an old story that the Post had to begin with that came out in 2022. This all occurred in 2018 when he wasn't in office, et cetera. The investigations are going nowhere. I know it's frustrating to you and to Fang or whatever you're going to say, and the diamonds that are all over the place. Comer, very bad at your job.
Well, wait a second. Where's the evidence it was a loan?
What? It was set out. The Post itself, our own New York Post.
What was the evidence?
The payback on it, and there was no interest because it was his son. That Hunter paid his dad back for the car loan.
But where was the loan initially from Joe to Hunter?
What?
That's what a loan is, Jessica. You loan someone money and they pay you back.
All right, we're getting a little bogged down, guys.
No, we are. Well, Jesse is. I wasn't bogged at all. I was actually flowing great. The juxtaposition of last night, so Biden is at the fundraiser and Donald Trump is doing his town hall with Sean Hannity. And Sean was doing his best to help him out, asking questions like, hey, buddy, are you planning on being a dictator? And then he floats around. He does a bunch of things. He says he's innocent, all these indictments. He's treated worse than Al Capone, blah, blah, blah. And then he eventually gets around to just saying, no, just dictator day one in terms of what I'll do on the border, et cetera. And people hear that. And they hear, yeah, this guy still continues to be a threat to democracy. And you think to 2 days ago when Arthel Neville, our own anchor, had to beam into Trump's remarks when he said, I won the 2020 election. Doesn't stop with the lies about it. And you can say it's not the most important issue to people, but people have been voting on preserving democracy. And that's what Joe Biden's talking about, that he was the guy who got Trump out, and he's the guy who can keep Trump out.
Okay.
So I imagine you would say the same about Stacey Abrams, who still is convinced that she won the gubernatorial election. But you know what?
Violent insurrection?
Stacey Abrams will not concede and never conceded that she lost the gubernatorial election. And then second time around really lost it even bigger. But look, I hope Joe sticks with the first answer. I hope he stays with the fact that, you know what, I'm the one, I'm in this to beat Donald Trump. Because if he sticks with that, then it goes right to the guts of what's going on in this race. And it shows that Biden is more focused on defeating Donald Trump and his Department of Justice, working with Florida, working with Washington, making sure that they've got all these indictments. They won't admit to the meetings that have been had between Justice Department officials and some of the state prosecutors. And it's all about defeating him. It's not about what he's going to do for the American people. It's this jealousy. It's this hatred. It's I'm the one who can beat him. And the saddest part of all this is when he's being asked the question, when he says, 50 people can beat him, like who? And he just walks away. It's such an arrogance that he has, such a condescension that he has for the press. Like, I don't have to answer that. Or, I'm not getting any money. Prove it. There is something that he's not a part of the American people and who he wants us to believe that he's one of us. He's not. And the fact that they're not even using Bidenomics anymore is proof positive of that. He doesn't relate to the American people. Maybe he did at one time, or maybe they were hoping that he would. But 76% of the American people believe the country's headed in the wrong direction. Joe Biden is the one who's running the country in the wrong direction. So, you know what? And the numbers now, Trump is ahead of Biden. I don't think Biden's going to be there to run as the candidate. I really don't.
It's a strange message to tell the American people that you need another 4 years.
There's a lot of strange things going in here, but I want to respond to Jessica bringing up 2020. Remember that Joe claims he ran against Trump based on a hoax, that Trump called Nazis fine people when he never did that. He was talking about fine people on both sides of the statue debate. He was actually complimenting the left who wanted to take down the statues. But the media covered up that hoax because they're dirtbags who wanted to call Trump an anti-Semite, even though he has grandkids that are Jewish. So it was a huge lie. And Jessica, you're right. It worked. Think about how Joe won the election. Fine people hoax, the Russian hoax, P-tape, the impeachment based on a phone call that turned out to be pretty damn accurate, the cabal that suppressed Hunter Biden's laptop, the idea that if you elected Trump, that would lead to war. And then what happened when Joe was elected? 2 wars. 2 wars, an imploded border, inflation, crime everywhere. And what was missing was what Joe promised, healing. He was going to heal us. The first thing he did, cleave the country in half, demonized Trump voters, extreme MAGA Republicans. Remember that? The biggest threat in our country, domestic terrorists, white domestic terrorists, parents who want to speak up about their kids. And then the key phrase that Joe said in this fundraiser, we can't let him win. We can't let him win. That's the bat signal, all right? You see The Atlantic devoting an entire issue to Trump is Hitler stories. Liz Cheney saying that Trump will end democracy as she goes on her media tour. And we have the president saying we can't let him win. So the fix is in, right? It's an explicit approval that all actions to stop Orange Hitler are permissible. And again, if you have the threat of Hitler in front of you, it would be immoral if you didn't do anything, right? Think about all the things you can do. You know, you can lie, you can cheat, you can kill. If you think that's an exaggeration, look at their exaggerations, right? He will cause World War III. He will end democracy. About a president who couldn't get Congress to build a wall, right? This makes no sense. And if you think they won't stop at violence, look at what happened after 2016 in D.C. Look at the Summer of Love. They're actually telling us now what they're going to do, right? We just watched 2 months of justification of sexual atrocity. We saw an entire group of people think it's okay what happened October 7th because it served a greater mission for them. So, you know, that's where I stand.
I see where you stand.
Thank you. And in a
where
lovely
you stand
sweat.
is where you sit.
Exactly.
In that sweater from Easter?
I'm preparing.
Maybe, yeah. You're working your way up to that ugly Christmas sweater. All right, up next, Democrats apparently think that standing up for female athletes is transphobic.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.